Welcome to Chapter 7, Inductive Arguments. Let's jump in. So inductive arguments claim that their conclusion probably follows the premise. So this is not a right or wrong type of argument. It is either stronger or weaker. Certain words and phrases kind of tip you off to the fact that things are an inductive argument. Those are words like probably, most likely, chances are, it's reasonable to suppose. However, not all inductive arguments contain these indicator words. So a watchdog. Most corgis make good watchdogs. My dog, Mindy, is a corgi. Therefore, Mindy is probably a good watchdog. So this is an inductive argument. It is not necessarily true or false. You just have to judge, is it a weak argument or is it a strong argument? Or maybe what degree of strength does this argument contain? There's three types of inductive arguments: generalizations, analogies, and causal arguments. So generalizations are when we draw a conclusion about a certain characteristic of a group or population based on a sample from that group. So you're not looking at the entire group, you're looking at a sample of the group and you are drawing conclusions based on that sample. And we do this all the time. We do this using polls and surveys. We use representative samples, random samples, and self-selected samples. This is when you read an article in a magazine and they've done some sort of survey and they draw conclusions based on the results of that survey. Have they asked everyone? No, they've not asked everyone. But they've asked a sample and they draw conclusions based on the answers that that certain group of people have provided. Have you ever made a generalization in your life that you later found out to be false? And this, I'm sure we all have, where we have maybe interacted with an individual and made a judgment call about them, and we've done that based on a generalization from our past experiences. So your participation in a poll helps provide an accurate portrayal of a specific group or population, right? We do this all the time for health reasons, for information about finances, the population, all sorts of things. People are polled and then they try to use this information to draw conclusions and maybe improve a system or process based on the feedback. An example would be faculty surveys, right? We ask every semester, you're sent links to fill out surveys about your classes, and that information is used to improve the classes. So a blind man and the elephant. I've used this analogy in the past before. This is a much better picture though. So there are three Indian men, and what they're trying to do is figure out what they're touching. And obviously, by looking at this picture, you can tell they're all blind. And you can see the first one is touching the trunk, the second one the leg, and the third one the tail. And although they are each having a very different experience, and maybe without the information from the others, it's hard to tell it's an elephant. But based on the collective information, they can tell it's an elephant, even though they're only touching certain parts of it. I wouldn't recommend this, by the way. If you see an elephant in India or any other country for that matter, don't go up and start pulling its tail and touch its legs and trunk. It might not end well for you. Evaluating inductive arguments using generalization. So when evaluating inductive arguments, there's a couple things you want to check when they are based on generalizations. And you want to check to make sure the premises are true. Decide if the sample is large enough. Sometimes they'll use a small sample size, which is not representative of the larger group. Decide if it is representative, meaning does it align well with what they're claiming. Decide if the sample is current and up to date. Is it a current sample or was it done 10 years ago? And determine whether the premises actually support the conclusion. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 indicators that help you evaluate the strength of generalizations. So analogy is making a comparison between two or more things. And metaphors are a type of descriptive analogy, and they're very common in literature. And analogies can be used on their own or as premises for arguments. Arguments using analogies are common in personal relationships, in law, and religion, and politics, and business, science, and the military. The success of an argument using an analogy depends on the type and extent of relevant similarities or dissimilarities between the things being compared. So evaluating arguments based on analogy, knowing how to evaluate the argument using the analogy is a valuable critical thinking skill. And here are the following strategies to try to figure out if the analogy is strong. Identify what is being compared, list the similarities, list the dissimilarities, compare your lists, examine possible counter analogies, and determine whether that analogy supports the conclusion. So this was a famous advertisement in the 80s, and what they did was they drew an analogy between using drugs and frying eggs in a pan. They said using drugs is like cooking your brains in a pan or something like that. But it's up to you to try to determine, is this a strong analogy? Is using drugs similar to taking your brain out and frying it in a pan? I don't know. You'll have to be the judge of that. And like I said at the beginning, these inductive arguments, not necessarily true or false, it is how strong is the argument. A causal argument, a cause is an event that brings about change or effect. So in causal arguments, something is claimed to have caused something else. Understanding cause and effect relationships is a crucial component to critical thinking. The one that comes to mind is some people believe that going out in cold weather or damp weather or the rain makes you sick. So is there a cause between going out in the rain and catching a virus? Some people say it's a strong argument. Other people say it's kind of weak. That's up for you to decide. So serial killer Ted Bundy claimed blamed pornography for his crimes. There's a good series on Netflix about him, and what he was saying was that he wouldn't be a serial killer if it weren't for pornography. Pornography turned him into a serial killer. So he used this argument as a defense. Obviously, they didn't think it was strong enough. They didn't think that relationship was strong enough, and it didn't go well for him. Here's another one you see a lot. Video games cause people to be violent, and so the Sandy Hook school massacre was when one of the students went in and shot up a bunch of people, and then later they said, well, it wasn't him. It was the video games. The video games is what caused him to go murder a bunch of people. Again, you have to evaluate the strength of that argument. Are the two things related? Are playing video games and that are violent and people shooting people related in a positive correlation? So here's correlations. When two events occur together at rates higher than probability, the relationship has a correlation. It's called a correlation. And there's positive correlations and there's negative correlations. So a positive correlation is an incident when one event increases the likelihood of the other thing happening. And a negative correlation is the exact opposite. If one thing happens, the likelihood of something else happens decreases. Evaluating causal arguments, knowing how to evaluate causal arguments, it makes it easier for you to employ them productively. So using these 5 criteria, or 4 criteria, is how we evaluate causal arguments. Determine whether the evidence for the cause in the relationship is strong. Make sure the arguments are free from fallacies. Decide whether the data is current and up to date. And make sure the conclusion does not go beyond the premises. So the final conclusion: knowledge of inductive arguments, including generalizations and analogies and causal arguments, is essential to function in the world and not be taken advantage of all the time. And as good critical thinkers, we must constantly identify and evaluate these types of arguments, both on our own and those presented by others. So that is a quick overview of inductive arguments. So you need to know what an inductive argument is, and you need to know there are three types: generalizations, analogies, and causal arguments. If you have any questions about any of that information, please don't hesitate to reach out and ask.